Welcome everyone to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here, and I'm also joined today by Dr. John Wong, my colleague at the Institute, who was a co-convener of the webinar. So today we are very pleased to welcome to the webinar Dr. Meng Zhang, who just started a new position as assistant professor of history at Vanderbilt University, and is going to talk to us about her new book, Timber and Forestry in Qing China, Sustaining the Market, which just came out with the University of Washington Press, and has already been praised from many sides. So we're looking forward very much to hearing her talk about the book. Now, before I hand things over to Dr. Zhang, I should mention a few words about the format of today's talk. So Dr. Zhang is going to talk for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A for Dr. Zhang to reply to then. So without any further ado, or wasting any more time, Meng, I hand things over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ghassan. And let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much for having me here and for the kind introduction. Really, I personally have learned a great deal from the webinars in this Chinese business history series. I'm very grateful that Ghassan and John have gathered scholars in this field from all over the world during this pandemic age. This is really one of the benefits from the pandemic. Today, I'm excited to have this opportunity to introduce some findings from the book. I look forward to your comments, and I'm sure the audience will have wonderful questions for discussion. So, do my best to keep the presentation within the time limit. Let me start with the cover image of my book, which comes from this section of Xu Yang's famous painting from the mid-18th century, Prosperous Suzhou. As the title suggests, it depicts the lively urban scenes with people from all walks of life in the affluent Lower Yangtze metropole of Suzhou. And this particular section shows two timber rafts floating into the city, supplementing the material basis of this prosperity. So timber was literally the building blocks of Chinese cities. If we think about the iconic architecture in the urban landscape of early modern China, the theaters, the guild chambers, the ancestral halls, even the brothels, tea houses, and so forth, all of those were built with timber logs. In response to such booming demand, an interregional trade structure developed over the course of several centuries and expanded to cover thousands of miles. By the late 18th century, by my estimate, the interregional timber trade market was bringing at least 5 million timber logs annually to the Lower Yangtze region. So the scope of the book is this whole supply chain that covered the entire basin of the Yangtze River, which connected the consumption center of the Lower Yangtze area to the forested mountains in the valleys of the Gan, the Xiang, the Yuan, and the Han rivers. So all of these are the tributaries of the Yangtze River. The temporal durability and the geographic scope of the timber trading system immediately generates two questions of sustainability that motivate the book. The first question is how to sustain a reliable supply of timber. Were there effective institutions for forest management? If so, what did they look like? The second question is how to sustain a business network that spanned more than 1,000 miles. Were there effective institutions for market activities to enable transactions between strangers? So the first question brings this project into the literature of forest history, common pool resource management, environmental governance, and so forth. The second question brings in the literature on new institutional economics, trade diaspora, commercial capitalism, and so forth. So both lines of literature have largely been informed by Euro-American historical experiences, and they come with very strong presumptions about what good practices or good institutions should look like. Against that benchmark, then the Chinese experience will look weird at first glance. My book not only seeks to delineate the actual mechanisms through which what seem to be peculiar Chinese practices worked, but also to review the intertwined connections between these two aspects to highlight the interdependence and co-evolution between the regime of resource production and the regime of resource distribution. So this is a point that so far has received little attention in the existing literature. The central argument that I try to convey in the book can be summarized by this triangular dynamic between the state, the market, and the forest. So to portray the big picture, I'm using these terms here as a shorthand, while in reality, each one of them denotes not an internally coherent entity, but as the book shows in more detail, very complicated dynamics and idiosyncrasies. So the presence of the state was rather removed for both the market and the forest. Laissez-faire is a loaded word, but I think in this case, it quite accurately captures the situation. By the 18th century, the imperial state had retreated from direct forestry and logging. It had come to depend on market procurement to meet its timber demand. It also had withdrawn from direct regulation of marketplaces and turned to depend on brokers and merchant organizations for both administrative and economic intermediation. Furthermore, the annual quota of timber tribute demanded by the imperial state from the territories within the Great Wall was in total only 7,000 logs, which was minimal compared to the annual market capacity of 5 million logs and above. And more remarkably, most of that market supply came not from natural forests, but from privately managed smallholder plantations. So this laissez-faire state both allowed for private claims of forest land and free market exchange of timber. And the state depended on private forestry and the private market supply for its own need. Both of these aspects were in great contrast to the model of European and Japanese state forestry. Now, moving on to the second node, the most remarkable feature during the late imperial period was the emergence of a very complicated system of market-oriented replantation of timber trees. This development was a very important countercurrent to the overall trend of deforestation in the face of tripling population growth in the Qing dynasty. I find a common set of forestry practices across the broad regions to the south of the Yangtze River. So these market-oriented reforestation practices entailed the following key features. First, they had private instead of state ownership of mountain lands. They practiced rotational planting of timber trees for sale in the market. And they used a shareholding structure to mitigate the challenges of long-term investment. As you know, the most common species of timber trees, China fir, usually demanded 3 to 4 decades to mature. So in that system, abstract shares were created based on land and labor input, and people used the shares to claim future profits from the growing trees. And the shares were treatable and divisible as liquid financial instruments using written contracts like this one from the southwestern province of Guizhou in 1819. So this system provided liquidity and liberated both the landowners and the tenant planters from the excruciating waiting period for the trees to grow up. I have discussed this replantation practices and their implications for environmental history in more detail elsewhere. Today, I'd like to skip through this part in order to leave enough time to talk about the business practices in the timber trade for this audience. But I can definitely talk more if people are interested during Q&A. Suffice it to say here that the key conclusion from this part is that smallholder market-oriented timber plantation could be possible and profitable in the long term, thanks to the creation of this abstract shareholding system. Now, going back to this triangle, plantation forestry gradually became the dominant source of timber for both the state and the market. It flourished under the property norms of local communities and responded flexibly to market prices. Lastly, the market itself was interregionally integrated and decentralized, satisfying the demands of the state and the private sector and channeling funds into forestry. What I want to stress here is that if forestry was important to satisfy the market was equally important for that particular form of private forestry as practiced in southern China, because profit along the supply chain translated through multiple layers into incentives on the ground for reforestation. When this chain of exchange and profit was challenged or even cut off, as was increasingly the case in the early 20th century, we don't see natural forest growing back thanks to slacking demand for timber, but rather the abandonment of timber plantation in favor of other cash crops or subsistence farming, like growing maize or potatoes, which led to serious environmental problems on the hillside. So if resource sustaining institutions had been important for the forest, under this general framework of late imperial China, market sustaining institutions were equally important to make sure that money would eventually go into forestry. So turning to market sustaining institutions, the timber trade business, this is a business of long distance bulk trade that run on short-term credit. It was haunted by the risks of default and information asymmetry. And like other businesses among strangers, it could be difficult to ascertain the financial solvency of a potential customer who was about to make a purchase on credit, right? So in combating such risks and in trying to enforce contract, the complementarity between formal and informal institutions played a big part. So this book focuses on the dynamics between merchant organizations, chambers of commerce, and the local court. But before talking about the collaboration among these institutions in contract enforcement, I first want to share some findings about the timber trade associations themselves, which I think are generally applicable to Chinese merchant organizations, usually called 会馆 or 公所, during this period. First, I hope to demystify the connection between a merchant organization's physical responsibility toward local government and its quote-unquote monopoly. So the Chinese merchant organizations were sort of similar to the European merchant guilds, but not exactly. A very important difference is that the Chinese merchant organization's so-called monopolistic attempt was usually not to keep newcomers out, but to force everyone in, right? In that, they try to solicit the local government's support through a rhetoric of their obligation to perform official duties, which usually meant supplying the local government with goods or money. So the logic goes, if your magistrate don't help us make sure that every timber trader is a member of our organization and pays the membership dues, then we cannot perform our duties toward the local government effectively. Of course, they would say this in a less confrontational manner. Here, the key word is actually attempt, in that they were often not successful. There is no chartered fiefdom. Rather, a merchant organization's sphere of authority was constantly challenged and modified. So dissenting merchant groups could easily establish a separate organization by petitioning to the local magistrate and dividing the official duties between themselves and the existing organization. So as a result, we see multiple associations of timber trade in the same locality. Merchant organizations provide a bundle of excludable benefits that were only available to members in good standing. So these benefits, with their high excludability and low rivalry, are typical examples of club goods in economics. So the exclusiveness of such services banded them together into a mutually reinforcing system that encouraged the members' compliance with the association's regulations in general. So for example, when the association said, let's all stop trading with this merchant because he still has uncleared debts to some of us, all of the members had more reasons to follow, because there's this set of services that they desire, but they could only get if they are in good standing with the association. So this exclusive bundle of services strengthened the association's capacity to enforce its internal regulations. One item that is worth noting is that you see here, collective taxation is listed as a valuable service to the members rather than a cost. So this actually reflects a shift around the mid-19th century with the introduction of the Li-Jin transit taxes. So in the High Qing era, there were only a dozen domestic custom stations that collected timber taxes, and the rate was quite low, usually below 3%. And the central state's direct control over local commerce was minimal, right? Local level commercial taxation was mostly levied on organized groups or licensed brokers. So it was relatively easy for unorganized individuals to escape from those tax burdens. So we could say that merchants during the High Qing era, merchants joined trade associations for its social and economic benefits despite more exposure to taxes. But after the introduction of the Li-Jin transit taxes in the 1850s, the state's capacity of direct taxation improved dramatically. There were, at the high point, about 2,500 Li-Jin tax stops nationwide. There was usually a long waiting line at the stations, and merchants faced extortions from the taxation clerks. But in many, though not all cases, merchant organizations could provide a leeway from such direct taxation measures. They were allowed to self-assess a collective quota, and their members were issued certificates to bypass these stations. So collective taxation was now perceived more as a benefit by members, so much so that a timber trade association could use it as a leverage to enforce its other regulations among its members and to attract non-members to join the association. So in this public letter to attract non-members, the Zhenxun Timber Association in Shanghai listed its collective taxation arrangement as one of the major benefits that it provides to its members. So it says, furthermore, the association undertakes annual contributions for the timber tax compared to each practitioner in this trade making his own individual payment. collective taxation precludes the malpractice of harassment and extortions at the tax stations and reduces our cost greatly. The benefit to our business is indeed remarkable. Over the years, the tax station negotiated with us, seeking to take it back to be run by the government directly, and attempted to increase the amount of our contributions. These attempts were only fended off by the association's endless endeavors and utmost struggles. So the combined effects of, on the one hand, the expansion of direct taxation apparatus, right? And on the other hand, its failure to completely replace the traditional indirect platform. Then this combined effect rendered the option of collective taxation through merchant organizations much more appealing to the merchants in the late Qing and Republican period. So now let's go back to the issue of contract enforcement. I've mentioned that merchant organizations regulated business norms. They used reputation mechanism, information sharing, and group sanctions to punish the party that breached contract. The credibility of these measures were boosted by the bundle of exclusive benefits that were only available to members in good standing. And toward the late 19th century, the association's collective taxation arrangement was increasingly perceived as one of these benefits rather than a drawback. In addition to merchant organizations, chambers of commerce, which was a semi-formal addition in the first decade of the 20th century, enhanced cross-regional communications with its national network and formalized the communication between merchant organizations and the court system. Then the formal court system recognized and enforced the business customs and enlisted the assistance of these other two institutions in adjudicating commercial disputes. Here I want to share a simple dispute case to illustrate how some of these organizations worked together to resolve a dispute. So this is a fraudulent bankruptcy case that involved players in Shanghai and in the Yongjia County of Zhejiang. The two places are about 300 miles apart, which is today a 5-hour drive, but at that time it took more than a week for timber transportation. So please mostly pay attention to the flow of information rather than the specifics of the case. So the case started with a transaction in Yongjia. So Lin Zhensheng bought timber from Liu Zhenfeng on credit without the intention to pay. Rather, with this and many other unpaid debts, Lin announced bankruptcy, and he absconded with the timber to Shanghai, and he sold the timber to two Shanghai stores, Yinji and Shengdalong. So after the grace period, Liu Zhenfeng, the original creditor in Yongjia, brought his complaint to the Yongjia Timber Trade Association. And the Timber Trade Association forwarded the case to the Yongjia Chamber of Commerce, which then contacted the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce. And the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce contacted the two stores in Shanghai directly, asking them to withhold their payment to Lin Zhensheng. After about a month, Lin's bankruptcy case was sorted out by the Yongjia Chamber of Commerce and the Timber Trade Association. All of his creditors, including Liu, agreed to a proportional settlement. So at this point, the two stores in Shanghai were instructed to forward their payment to the Zhenxun Association, which is the local timber trade association in Shanghai. And this association then forwarded the money to the Yongjia Chamber of Commerce, and the Yongjia Chamber of Commerce oversaw the delinquency of all of Lin's total assets and distributed the payment to all of his creditors. So this was a relatively simple case, and it was resolved successfully. The channels of communication and the measures taken in this case were quite representative. The coordinated action of these organizations was far more flexible and effective than if they had to rely on the court system exclusively. So in this case, by having the two stores in Shanghai hold on to the money payable to Lin Zhensheng until further instruction, the trading associations representing the interest of the creditors effectively froze part of Lin's assets. And the right to dispose of the frozen money was entrusted to a third party, the Yongjia Chamber of Commerce, to make sure that Lin's residual assets would be fairly distributed among all of his creditors. So the role played by the network of chambers of commerce was particularly important given the lack of political unity and legal clarity in the early years of the Republican period. And by curbing fraudulent transactions, this web of complementary institutional arrangements enhanced the use of credit and facilitated the smooth flow of timber. So to conclude, the book highlights the interactions between the market, the state, and forestry as an intertwined whole. Right? We have seen that the interregional timber market was open and profitable to a very diverse group of players along the supply chain, from mountain landowners to tenant planters to lumberjacks and rafters, from itinerant merchants to brokers and retailers and merchant organizations. The state retreated from direct forest management and market control, but relied on indirect measures to procure materials and monitor market activities. The merchant organizations and layers of formal and informal platforms of contract enforcement, which I should emphasize, which is not unique to the trade of timber, but widely applicable to long distance trade during this time. They provide the channels to resolve disputes and encourage faithful transactions to the extent possible. So the system's sustainability rested on the smooth circulation of trees, logs, people, and capital. Obstruction to any segment of this cycle, whether it was a blocked transportation route or a financial crisis that eroded the merchant's working capital, those types of obstructions would ultimately factor into the decision of whether to cut trees and when to cut trees and whether to replant them after cutting. So to call this system sustainable in the weak sense of sustained yield and sustained socio-economic relations should not be read as a call for deregulation or privatization in terms of forest management or common pool resource management. This is not an argument that this particular late period Chinese model of private forestry and private market for timber were better than the model of state forestry, although it does serve to challenge the often assumed success or trump of state forestry. Right? But more importantly, what I want to stress is that the label of the ownership or regulation regime, whether we call it public or collective or private, that matters much less than how well the specific dimensions work together. So the key message is one about systematic coherence, right? So when one node of this triangle is forcefully changed without appropriate coordination from the other nodes, the system tends to break down as it happened in the 20th century, right? So just briefly, the rush to state forestry in the 1940s and 1950s, for example, not only encroached upon the space of private timber merchants, but also disturbed the size of timber plantation because it stripped the local tree growers of their discretion and bargaining power, which led to a round of premature cutting. And then between the 1950s and 1980s, radical and frequent policy changes in forest tenure defeated the local community's confidence in the security of their holdings, even when the new policies were in their favor. So if there is any valuable lesson from this history, it is probably the appreciation that public efforts would be better spent in coordinating with existing institutions and practices than trying to invent wholly new institutions from scratch. Actually, in recent years, we see in southern China a revival of many of the forestry practices that had a deep root in the late imperial period, including such flexible responses to market incentives, voluntary self-organization through shareholding systems, and some inexpensive and rapid methods to resolve minor conflicts. So with appropriate institutional and administrative support, some carefully designed subsidies, maybe, these historical practices could prove to be useful legacies toward our contemporary goals of resource conservation and regeneration. Okay, I will stop here, and I'll look forward to further discussions with the audience. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Meng, so much for giving us this wonderful overview of your book. So as I said, we have some time now for Q&A. So please submit any questions you might have through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I'll then read them out for Dr. Zhang to answer. So I thought maybe I could start us off with a question that I immediately had when you were talking about futures of timber, and how basically this liquidity problem of the long time that it took to actually grow these trees, how that was solved. And of course that, I mean, the sort of question of, why did, what kind of forms of, I guess, tools of credit did develop in early modern China, and why were there kind of forms of futures and things of that sort that you describe, but there was not, we didn't see sort of the development of a proper stock market, I guess, that might have allowed for the trading of these kind of futures. And of course, David Four has written about this, and I was also reminded immediately of Joseph McDermott's work on the Huizhou merchants, who also talks about futures of this sort. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about how these futures exactly work, and whether we ever see them being traded, and how that would have worked, and maybe why sort of the trade in these kind of futures didn't develop into a bigger sort of market or stock market of sorts.
Right. So I think we use the company, McDermott and other historians. I think we detect the mechanisms of similar to futures in these transactions of timberland properties. But when we think about the scale of these transactions, it's really small, right? And it's very localized. So for example, in such investments in, timber holdings, most of the transactions happen in adjacent villages, right? Only in small number of cases, we see maybe merchants from a different county, or merchants from in faraway places, timber merchants who came in to buy timber, would sort of get in early to make an investment in anticipation of harvesting in future years. So that is to say, we actually don't see the coming in of merchant capital directly into the rural mountainous areas. These are still, the contracts themselves were also very similar to just normal land transactions, right? Land deeds, which mostly happen at a localized level. I think I see the system as a response to their capital restraint, right? So from a mountain landowner's perspective, if I have ample cheap capital, so if I have money at hand, or if I can borrow very cheaply, I I probably would prefer to hire wage labor to plant the trees, right, which wouldn't take very long. And I will enjoy the proceeds in the future totally by myself, right? But instead, what we see is a sort of the division of shares between landowners and labor, usually 60% to 40%. So the reason, so my understanding is that they were restricted in terms of capital, right? So they didn't really have the spare money to pay wages. Instead, they use this sharecropping system, and the sharecropping system then developed into abstract shares that could be exchanged.
Yeah, all right, thank you. I think, yeah. John, do you have a?
Sure. If I may jump in as well, somewhat related to Ghassan's question, but also dovetailing with what you left with at the end of the presentation. I want to see how it's great to see that there are so many studies on different parts of these long distance trades, focusing on different geographic areas, focusing on different commodities. I wonder if there's something special about lumber, wood, forestry that your story tells us. It maybe I think that's the part that overlaps with what Ghassan just asked about the futures market. I wonder if there is something. Maybe there are some differences depending on the commodity you trade, how easily they can become standardized so that there can be more of a standard market for them. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the contracts and how they may specify qualities or specifications of what they are supposed to deliver, and maybe help us understand how easy or how difficult it might be to standardize lumber as a commodity.
Oh, that's a great question. Because in this trade, they have a very peculiar system for the measurement and pricing of logs. So first I would say that the standardization of different grades of grain is also well known, right? The upper grade, mediocre grain, and so forth. Rice, we sort of know that. But for logs, it faced the problem of because most of the available supply was not from natural forests, right? It was from the plantations, and I think because of that, they came up with this realization of the time value of money. So when they price the logs, there is a very clear understanding that the value of based on volume is an exponential relationship rather than a linear function of volume, right? But they didn't express this with an exponential function apparently, but they come up with a very detailed table that assign an abstract sort of what they call a 龙泉马, a ma, to each grade of timber. And in the market, the price of timber is not expressed as certain amount of liang per cubic meter, but rather it is expressed as this amount of tael per 龙泉马, while ma itself is actually an exponential function of volume. So that to me is a very ingenious system, even though they don't have the mathematical expressions. But I think this sort of reflect their understanding of the time value of money and this attempt at standardizing the measurement and pricing of timber.
Great. Our first question from the audience comes from Austin Dean, and he says, thanks very much for this talk. Can you talk a little bit about marketing or branding of timber? From one point of view, timber is a commodity, but to what extent do we see differentiation in terms of reputation? Something along the lines of tree from this county in Zhejiang are the best.
Oh, that's great. Not at that level, but there's a general understanding that timber from Hunan is better than timber from Jiangxi, and timber from Western Hunan is better than timber from Eastern Hunan. So I try to understand why that is the case, right? Because in market prices, we see differentiations between timber from Jiangxi and timber from Hunan. But I think the answer is not so much in the reputation of a particular firm, but rather in terms of forestry practices. So in Hunan, they tended to wait for 30 to 40 years before they cut the trees. But in Jiangxi, the practice is 25 to 30 years. So the logs from Jiangxi are smaller.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Gavin Coates. And he asks, or he says, I've heard of very large-scale reforestation initiatives, especially to try to stop desertification. I assume there have been government initiatives in the past. You mentioned some of the traditional systems that might be used to encourage regenerative forestry. Please, can you tell us a bit more? And could this reduce the pressure on forests elsewhere, for example, in Africa, South America, etc.?
Right. So in recent years, I guess the biggest government initiative in reforestation was in North China, right? To sort of fend off the desertification in Mongolia and so forth. So that measure was largely successful, right? But it proved to be very expensive. Because it sort of still relied on the continued provision of government subsidies, and all of this planting was led by government agencies. But in addition to that, in southern China, there's also this initiative to encourage people to plant what they call economic trees, right? Trees that are planted rotationally for economic uses. In the southern provinces, it had become more sustainable in the sense that people continue to plant trees despite the lowering of government subsidies after the initial years. And in the places that are most successful, we actually see the farming households forming into a voluntary shareholding structure with their neighbors, right? I don't think people are actually aware that in the Qing dynasty, this is how it worked. But it's fascinating to see that in exactly these provinces where the shareholding reforestation had been a popular practice in the Qing dynasty, in these same provinces, we see the forming of these voluntary organizations where people try to pool their sort of household responsibility forests.
All right, thanks. The next question comes from Matthew Lowenstein. He says, thank you, amazing talk and amazing book. And he has two questions rather than one. So the first question is, do we know anything about how timber merchants conducted clearing and settlements? And did this change in the Republican period? And the second question is, do we actually see corporate or zihao purchases of timberland and or futures in the late Qing, or are this mostly lineages and or individuals? Thank you.
I didn't quite understand the first question. Matthew, are you talking about the accounting practices? I'm not sure. But in any case, I guess my answer is that if you are talking about how they clear accounts and settle their debt, we have information about, so especially in Shanghai and areas around Shanghai, which became this regional center for timber trade, for both domestic timber and imported timber by the late Qing. They gradually came to a consensus that there's a 4-month grace period. Actually, from the internal regulations of the Shanghai Timber Trade Associations, we saw the extension of this grace period from 1 month to 2 months to 3 months until eventually they settled on 4 months. And the agreement is that we cannot continue extending this anymore. We'll stick with this 4-month deadline. And so that is to say, they actually have, so in terms of settling their debts, the associations had a dedicated team in trying to settle the accounts with purchasers mostly from Zhejiang and Jiangsu. So they send their delegations to the smaller marketplaces in Jiangsu and Zhejiang every 4 months and send letters to them, almost like ultimatum that if you don't make the payment by this deadline, we're going to carry out group sanctions against you. So that was very funny to see. The second question is about corporate purchases of timberland and futures. Are this mostly lineages and or individuals? I sort of mentioned this briefly in answering a previous question. So this is the transaction of timberland and the futures, the shares, was very localized. So we do see, for example, lineage trusts in these localities, where in nearby villages or counties came in to try to make investments. But so far, I don't see a lot of evidence of merchant houses or merchant partnerships making great investment in this. A couple of examples, but not extensively.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Xavier Ante. And he says, you described the timber plantation system as something that is shared across space in China. I wonder, however, how about they might have differed? For instance, the practices in like the Qing River area versus the practices in places like Huizhou. How would you describe the differences in production, if there were any, in contracts? And building on Ghassan's question, would you think it is plausible that there were more market frictions in some areas relative to others, for example, in minority areas, just like the Qing area?
Oh, that's a great question. So in the book itself, actually, I both made comparisons between the Qing River area and Huizhou, and I also talk about the sort of market, the license brokerage system and how it differed in the frontier markets. I would say that in terms of forestry practices, when we compare, for example, the southwestern areas and more established forestry places like Huizhou, the general picture is similar, right? In both places, actually, most of the places to the south of the Yangtze River, we see the existence of these shareholding schemes. But one major difference, though, is that in Huizhou, the role played by the lineage and lineage trusts were much more visible than in the Qing River area. So in Guizhou, they did gradually sort of start to adopt the language of lineage, and there were some sort of private trusts. Some of them were for the purpose of providing ancestral sacrifices, some of them for other religious purposes. But most of these trusts that existed in the southwestern regions did not really correspond to an overarching lineage structure. They were more sort of based on private interests that are formed by maybe kings and non-kings, right? So I feel like the difference in the degree of lineage control is a big contrast between the two areas. And in the frontier markets, the state also the state's concern for the social stability and to try to reduce ethnic tensions in the frontier market also came to influence the way in which timber trade was conducted in the Han-Miao border, right? In most of the markets in, let's say, China proper, right? So Hankou, Hangzhou, Nanjing, and so forth. There is a limit on the number of brokerage licenses, but in principle, anyone could apply for it, right? The application process is, fairly open, and people can join a brokerage guild even, and can get into that business. But in the frontier area, out of this concern for protecting the livelihood of the local Miao people, the state for a long time sort of kept this more monopolistic system where only the residents of 3 market towns, as the question already mentioned, like the Dangjiang system, right? Only the residents of these market towns could open timber brokerages, and the state refused to sort of introduce the nationwide licensed timber brokerage system to this area to prevent the Han merchants from getting deeper into the mountainous areas. Until in the late 19th century, under all of the new financial pressures, that trying to protecting Miao livelihood was no longer a top priority, and then the market became wide open to not only Han merchants but also foreign capital as well by the late 19th century.
All right, and the next question comes from Yun Kyo Lee. And the question is, or the comment is, thank you for the interesting presentation, Dr. Zhang. I was wondering if the relatively developed market structure created for the establishment of forestry industry trading accompanied with state involvement during the Qing dynasty also had extended to other industries of goods. And also, how have these imperial models of industry development been translated to or influenced or had an influence towards the later 20th century Republican period and post-1949 industry development?
Right. My understanding is that, I tend to see the trade of timber as representing bulk long distance trade in general. So in terms of merchant organizations, their collaboration with the local government, collective taxation, their internal structures, internal regulations to enforce contract, in all of those aspects, I don't think the timber trade was very different from many other sort of bulk commodity trade. So in that part, I see timber trade as a case study that should have sort of general implications for our understanding of Chinese trade environment in general. The forestry, so in terms of the planting of trees, again, the mechanism is rooted in agricultural production, right? So as I said, if we look at the contracts themselves, the structure, the language, the terms, even such notions of the landowner's contribution and the laborer's contributions, all of these terms had a deep root in the contracts for other types of agriculture production, especially for rice, but also for other cash crops. The only difference is that timber does require such a long period to grow. So it is in the trade of timber that we see the development of this language of share then become abstract instead of referring to really specific physical trees. So in that, I think forestry was different. It had this very special characteristic. But I feel like once we get into the 20th century and once the preservation of forest became part of the national rhetoric during the Republican period, and by the 40s, this impulse to nationalize forest and to nationalize other natural forests came to the forefront. That was a moment of rupture for forestry practices, I think. So if we, think about when really is the sort of transformative moment in Chinese forestry practices, I tend to look at that big transition in, the late Republican, early PRC period, when the ideal is no longer sort of trusting these private players to sort it out, but rather the state had more urge to collectivize forest resources. And again, I want to stress that this is not a development that happened just after 1949. We see this trend already going on in the last 10 to 15 years of the Republican period as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think our next question, which will also need to be our final question, comes from Zheng Zhaojin. I think it goes kind of in the same direction. So he asks, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the connection or discontinuity between state-run forest farms and the PRC practice lasting to today and the timber trade practice in the Qing Republican periods. Are there any lessons or legacies that early timber trade left on timber resource management in China today? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think mostly lessons. So as I said, I do feel like from the late Republican, early PRC period, the ideal shifted and state practices shifted. And so we do recognize that the state is now very eager to preserve forest resources, which is a good thing. Of course, part of the reason is to use the timber resources for industrialization, which then lead to deforestation is a part of the same story. But there is this general understanding that we want to have these natural resources under public management. However, what I see as a big problem in this process is that, at least in the early decades, there is no distinction between natural forests and plantation forests, right? So I think, for natural forests, for example, the natural forest in Manchuria, in the northeastern provinces, it makes a lot of sense. To achieve the goal of preservation, it makes a lot of sense for the state to set strict restrictions, right? To have some sort of regulation on who can come in and cut timber in what amount, and we want to sort of make plans for prolonging the natural forest. But when you use the same set of strict regulations on who can cut, who can sell, who you can sell it to, we apply this system to privately planted forests. There's a huge problem because if people cannot make profit from the trees that they planted, right? If they cannot make the decision in response to favorable market prices, but instead they have to apply for a permit and they cannot get the permit, they can only sell to the state timber bureau, for example, and they could not try to sell for a higher price, then they just stop planting it, right? Then there's no forest to be regulated anymore. So the biggest lesson, as I see it, is that there need to be sort of a clearer distinction between preservation of natural forests and the encouragement for private parties to participate in the planting of timber trees for economic purposes.
All right, thank you. We have one really final question from which I still think I want to bring up, and that's from Luman Wang. And she says, dear Dr. Zhang, thank you so much for the great talk. A quick question. Based on your understanding, was China ecologically constrained in the 19th century? And how does your research on timber trade add new insights to our understanding of the Great Divergence debate?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, especially in the Great Divergence debate. The availability of deforestation and then the problem with the availability of fuel is one of the central issues there. So I think in terms of timber, right, which is logs that are big enough to be used as construction materials, right, and worthwhile enough to be transported over long distance from this place to a faraway place. In terms of that, right, timber for construction, I don't think there is sort of very serious constraint in that regard. Imperial constructions is a different matter, right? Because imperial constructions call for huge, extraordinary timber that is only available from old growth forests. And by the 19th century, that certainly posed a problem for the emperors. But for sort of common people's daily construction uses, it's okay. However, I still think that China was ecologically constrained in the 19th century. Maybe not for construction timber, but if, for example, we turn to fuel, there's great fuel shortage problems in many parts, especially along the eastern coast. But it never became worthwhile to transport firewood from one place to a far, over long distance, right? But fuel shortage was a big problem. And in terms of sort of general ecology, even in the timber trade, we see traces of ecological deterioration, especially in water transportation, right? In the 19th century, when state resources that previously poured into the maintenance of river transportation were no longer available, the transportation of timber itself also faced difficulties with more flooding and sort of disasters when dams broke and so forth. So yeah, in general, in terms of general ecological conditions, I do feel like there is a deterioration in the 19th century.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Zhang, for that. And as we are sort of coming to the end of sort of running out of time, all that remains for me is really to thank you again for giving us such a wonderful introduction to your book, and also to for answering so patiently all of our questions. So thank you very much for that. Before we close, I should just mention that the next Chinese Business History webinar will take place on the 29th of October, when we will have Koval Meiskens from the Naval Postgraduate School talk about his recent book, Mao's The Front, the Militarization of Cold War China. And we will advertise that as normally on our website and through social media. And so I hope to see many of you there. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Zhang, for your talk and for answering the questions. I hope many of our viewers will have a look at your wonderful book. And of course, also thank you to everyone that tuned in. And yeah, I hope to see many of you at the next webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you at the next event.
All right. Bye-bye.